everybody, and welcome to part 4. Remember, this video series and the video series that will follow are part of a forum section that I'm setting up on my website. You can go check it out at adamduff.com. I'll leave a link in the description. So that way you can leave comments, ask questions, you can get to know the art a bit more, and get to make some connections in the community as it builds, right? Because it's still a brand new project. That being said, I blotted out the flag in the background just to make space because I found that flag was making me feel a little bit claustrophobic. So I was like, take it out. I'll worry about it after. It's not a big deal. It was only a couple of minutes of work out of my time, so it wasn't a big deal. Now, you need to know a little bit more about the narrative of this character as well. In this particular case, we're starting on ridicule. And this character is different. I wanted to step outside of what we had going on so far, and I had researched the theme of suffering a little bit more, and I wanted to explore empathetic suffering, whereas the suffering of watching somebody else. In this particular case, he is not really a threat to you so much as he's a threat to himself. He's a victim of abuse to a certain degree. And it's through this character, through watching the suffering of this character, that you are feeling pain yourself, right? So what I wanted to do was make sure that what I do to this character, or at least what he's done to himself or what has been inflicted on him, is something that is very difficult for you to see. So that's why I decided to delve into the subject of ridicule. Now, what inspired me was a little bit of events that have happened in my life, but of course exaggerated because I've lived a very good life. Don't get the wrong impression. But how I feel when I've seen certain people in certain situations, and something that's actually only been enhanced since the online world came out, and that is bullying, ridicule, and the different forms that it takes. And one of the things I thought about was, there were a few things. The first was how a victim of bullying very often reacts. You remember I was talking about smiles and how a different smile can mean a different thing? Well, in his particular case, I thought about if you've ever witnessed somebody being bullied, which I'm sure most people have, because unfortunately bullying is quite common, very often the victim of the bullying will laugh as well. People are laughing at somebody, but he'll laugh too, right? He or she will laugh too. Not because they actually find it funny, because I think personally it's because psychologically that person who's being bullied, ridiculed, insulted publicly is laughing almost in a way to suggest that they are in on the joke. They think it's funny too, which is a way of kind of psychologically taking you away from the victim role, right? You're haha, yeah, I know, I'm such an idiot, right? When you know it's not the case. You know that they're actually quite hurt inside. And I imagined the heartless people that did this to him, how they taunted and ridiculed him, and I really had to exaggerate that in order for you, the audience, to feel it, to actually experience it. So I delved into different things. I thought about, how vulnerable people in a kind of a bondage type of situation, like if you've ever seen the movie Pulp Fiction, right? The guy who gets the ball strapped into his mouth and stuff like that, tied up, dominated type of guy, right? How vulnerable they look with this ball in their mouth. So I kind of had that idea too. The other idea I had was actually from a documentary I saw on Netflix. If you have Netflix, you can probably go check it out yourself. It's a documentary about a guy who suffers having a very small penis. An unusually small penis. So what he does is, instead of like saying, I'm a victim, feel sorry for me, what he does is he actually decides to go around the world to different countries, Africa and India and China, and he explores how men address the issue of having a small penis. And in one particular case, I think it was China, one of the practices that they do in China, I don't know how common it is, but uh, certain people actually make a living, a profession, or at least a, a common, got to stop using the word common, a practice of strapping a heavy weight to their junk, right? Because I hate using the word penis. I find that the most offensive word on earth. To their junk, um, with a leather strap, and they suspend it and actually swing it back and forth between their legs. Just a very unpleasant thing altogether, you know. And as they gain experience, as they get better at it, the weight gets heavier and heavier. And they show, like in one particular case, there's this master, you know, if you could call him the original swinger, you know, he has like he's carrying a weight that's heavier than me. You know, I'm 6'3", I weigh about 180 pounds. Um, he had about 250 pounds hanging off of his Frankenbeans, right? I'm just sitting there and I'm sweating looking at this going, oh God, this is horrible. Well, it also, when I put that and mix that with the context of being bullied, I imagine the humiliation of having somebody has their pants pulled down in public, exposing their genitals in public, right? And having people laugh, ha, you've got such a small dick, you know, that type of thing. And just this utter humiliation of being exposed publicly. So I wanted to bring some of that in. I was really trying to tap into some pretty harsh feelings. Now, why did I make him a tall guy? Well, I've been bullied a little bit, as I was made fun of. I wasn't that popular in elementary school. I wasn't a skinny guy. I was actually quite chubby before I sprouted up. Very often, people who grow tall just as they're hitting puberty, they gain a lot of weight before they shoot up because they need that extra body fat to, you know, to be able to protect their body from quick growth, which is something I went through. I wasn't lanky, but I was tall. And because I was made fun of and taunted in elementary school, again, I'm not a victim. I lived a very happy life, but I did deal with that stuff. I know what it feels like. Because I was tall, I hated my height. I remember even telling my mother at a certain point, I hate being tall. I was probably around like 7 or 8 years old, and it's like, I hate being tall. They always put you in the back row in pictures. You always kind of stick out like a sore thumb. You feel kind of this goofy kind of excluded kid, and I hated that feeling. And my mother always said, Adam, you're going to like it when you get older. Just wait. You know, I was like, no, I hate it. I wanted to be the same height as everybody else. I didn't like being the tall kid. When you're bullied, you can hate anything about yourself. You can hate being too perfect on top of it. You know, there's always a reason to hate yourself. So, which I strongly discourage, of course. But this was a feeling I related to. So I wanted to kind of delve into this emotion. Now, why did I? You'll notice that I'm kind of gutting him. I'm tearing open his stomach and I'm leaving a hole through his gut. And that was to reflect his inner feeling, the emptiness. Very often when you feel that kind of humiliation, I don't know about you, but I feel it. I would feel it in my gut. That's kind of where I would imagine feeling that. It's a nervous anxiety feeling in your gut. And it also reflects his hollow laughter, because if you'll see his expression is not one of pain, it's an expression of laughter. But I wanted to make it empty, painful laughter, right? So as a gesture, as a kind of symbol of his hollow feeling, I tore open his stomach, and I combined that with this device that's strapped off of his junk that isn't only strapped onto his, you know, how many expressions am I going to use for penis? Jesus, I'll just call it his dick. Excuse me for profanity, but this thing that he's hanging off of his dick is also fastened onto his stomach, and it's tearing his skin to help further emphasize. You'll see I'm starting to design it now to further emphasize this painful, stinging pain in his gut, right? So there's a lot going on with this guy. There's the humiliation, the kind of S&M type of domination thing going on with his face. I'm going to give him a headdress that suggests a beanie. Because back in the day, I don't know if you're younger, you might not know about this. If you're around my age, you're very familiar with it. The dunce cap, something that teachers would do to humiliate a student that they felt was misbehaving. They would put this cone on his head, or this hat, and they would call it a dunce cap, dunce meaning idiot, right? And they would sit him in the corner and so that they could be ridiculed, essentially. Very cruel practice in the schools and stuff like that. So I wanted to give a little bit of that as well to put you in the context of him feeling like a big goof that stands out as a big goof. That's why I made him taller than everybody else as well. I wanted him to stand out, somebody who you could point at, and somebody who stood out in a crowd that you could point at and laugh at type of thing. So you really feel the humiliation of this character. You can see how much I have to push this. I have to push this on an emotional and on a design level so that you can really feel what's going on, right? I want you to feel his humiliation. I want to push that humiliation so that you can feel it in him. And anatomically, you notice I have his wrists, his hands kind of pointing out to kind of push that kind of kind of big goof type of posture. Okay, make him lanky, an awkward lankiness. He's slouched. His shoulders are slouched forward, and the slouch helps also emphasize the device that I'm fastening onto his gut and his chest. That's a very painful feeling. It's a metallic device that's hooked onto his collarbone and strapped under his rib cage to rip upwards, and then he's got that device hooked to his abdomen and his groin pulling downwards, so that creates this horribly painful feeling. Now, he's also not engaging you, right? We have engaging you as in he's not interacting with you. We have suffering, suppression, who's looking right at you. We've got anguish, who's looking right at you. We've got a burden, who's screaming at you. But ridicule isn't doing anything of that. Because his eyes are closed and looking away, it's forcing you to look at him. He's pulling your attention in towards him, right? So there's a very different narrative. If you've seen my King's Harem series of tutorials, I really describe that in length, talking about visual narrative and how body language and how engaging an audience with your eyes affects how your audience will treat that character, right? You can call it the fourth wall. In a theater, we have three walls. If you're looking at a movie in a theater, we have three walls. We have, or at least the actors live within a world of three walls. The left of them, the right of them, and behind them. But as soon as they break that fourth wall, i.e. the movie screen, they're immediately engaging their audience, the people watching the movie. And that completely changes the dynamic of the illustration you're doing. He's not breaking the fourth wall. He's pulling you into the image, right? And all of these devices that I'm strapping on him are designed for you to feel sorry for him, and sorry for him to the point where you suffer, right? Because you can empathize with this character. That's what's hugely important about it. Now, what's important about the design when I was fashioning this hat on him as well was it was kind of tricky because I'm doing silly. The suggestion is silliness. He's a moron, right? That you can either choose to jeer and taunt, or you can feel horribly sorry for him for being in that position and want to take it off of him, right? Because it's strapped to his head, he can't. But there's a tricky play between making him look ridiculous to the point where he loses his demonic narrative, and being silly enough for you to put him in the context of being ridiculed, right? It's is a delicate play between the two. That's why I kind of played around with his devices a little bit more, playing around with it because I was playing around between that very narrative. I want him to be in the context of being ridiculed without you laughing at it. As soon as I do that, especially in the context of all of these other characters in the same scene, I can kill the whole scene with that. Like, what the hell is this all about? It can really damage the whole narrative of the entire piece. So it's important to take that into account. Now, in the terms of his groin, I was careful about this because remember, I'm also a father of 3 kids. So for me, 99% of the work that I've produced is generally, even if it's got a darker theme, it's child safe. It's not the kind of stuff that will scare kids, right? When I was producing this work, I had to make a conscious decision that this is not for my kids. as a father, I'm very conscious of this stuff. I'm thinking, ooh, do I want my kids to be exposed to this kind of stuff? I'm getting into some pretty heavy adult stuff by bringing genitals into it. Ironically, in our culture, I can show pain, I can show knives and heads being cut off, but this moment I bring genitalia into it, especially as a father, I'm crossing a sensitivity barrier for me and for my audience, right? So I had to make a decision at that point. This is not for my kids. My kids have seen this work and they really didn't think anything of it, either too young to care or too old to care, luckily in my case. But I was sensitive to that very thing. I wouldn't, for instance, if I'm going to actually show genitals, I would do so in a respectable manner. In this particular case, I'm suggesting it because it's actually covered. But yeah, that's just something to take into account. But in this particular case, I have this device strapped onto his schlong. I'll use a different term every time I refer to his groin. Strapped onto his schlong. That's ridiculous. I haven't used that word in about 20 years, but strapped onto his dick. Oh God, I'm really struggling with this. I really wanted to emphasize the pain of it, so that's why I really wanted to make it a massive weight sitting on the end of it. I also want to emphasize the digging into his rib cage type of idea. It's a focal point. If you're going to take that route, go all the way with it. Don't kind of, there could be something there. No, I want this weight. This weight is an important part of the narrative. In fact, probably the most important part of the narrative, because it's the most humiliating and it's the most uncomfortable, especially if you're a guy. Any guy looking at that would definitely, if you're actually to see this in a live action film, every guy in that audience would cross their legs and go, "Ooh, damn!" Women would kind of feel sympathy pains for the guy, but guys would really be able to identify with that kind of discomfort. Whereas what's strapped onto his body is very much that's a universal pain that everybody could probably relate to. Now, in terms of his facial expression, which we're going to be exploring a little bit later on, right now we're just rendering out the metal the same way we had before. Just watch, you'll see how it's done. But as far as his facial expression is concerned, you're going to see that I play around with it a lot because I'm not only in his expression of humiliated laughter, I also wanted to inject a little bit of joy in his face. Now again, depending on context, joy can be very unpleasant or pleasant. If you're watching kids play and one of the kids accidentally dumps a bucket of water on their head and everybody laughs, that's happy joy, right? But in the case of ridicule, to see joy is very out of context and can be quite disturbing. A very good example of that, and something that kind of sparked this idea as far as how I approached his facial expression, is Blair Witch Project, if you've ever seen it. A brilliant film, especially at the time it came out, because it was kind of the first of its genre. It was set in a believable setting, which helped emphasize the credibility of this film and made it even more frightening. But there's one scene in particular that I think was probably, in my opinion, one of the scariest scenes in that entire film. Excuse me, spoiler, if you don't want me to spoil it if you haven't seen it yet. And that's the scene where they're actually in the tent at night, and you can hear kids playing outside, and then at one point the kids are kind of like start to mess with the tent and whack the tent and shake it around, and they all freak out, right? That's when one of the guys in the tent just freaks out and takes off. Now, the reason why that was such a scary and disturbing scene is because it was so out of context. The sounds of children playing are generally a very joyful thing. It's very happy. It's very energetic and innocent. But in the middle of a forest, miles and miles away from nearest town, in pitch blackness, at 2 o'clock in the morning, hearing children playing outside is very disturbing, right? Because it's so completely out of place. So in this particular case, he is in a very emotionally and physically painful place. By adding joyful laughter to it, I'm not suggesting that he's having a good time. but then I am, because he's um, in a position where most people would be devastated, both physically and emotionally. And the fact that there is a glimmer of joy in his face shows just how sick he is. It shows that he's probably, out of all of these characters that we've got going on, this guy is probably the most disturbed, not only because of what he's inflicted on himself, but because of what other people have inflicted on him as well. It snapped him, so to speak. So the fact that he's actually laughing shows a really, really messed up headspace, right? Just to get, but I didn't want to push that to the point where it made him comical. I wanted to push it just far enough for you to go, what the hell is wrong with this guy, right? It's kind of the headspace I was trying to put you in. He's not so much a sociopath either, because the other characters are very much sociopaths in the sense that they are completely, uh, uh, completely apathetic to your suffering, right? They can inflict endless pain on you and they'll never stop. They don't care, they don't feel it, they love it. In his particular case, he's not a sociopath in the sense where he's not doing anything to you per se. He's sadistic to himself, right? He's there's something wrong with him in the sense that he's got absolutely no self-respect anymore. The fact that he's done this to himself and even find a little bit of joy out of it. And you're going to see as I play around with it, I've got those kind of screws that are screwed into his neck. You've got to be careful with, like, when you're designing, you have to take everything into account. You've got to always take everything into a physical perspective. When you're designing fabric, when you're designing armor, when you're designing these types of devices, which is a certain type of demonic fashion, one of the things that really injects a lot of feeling and a lot of depth into your piece is to think about how this fabric feels. How does it feel, right? How does it feel to wear it? One of the things that really resonated with me a lot was listening to a lot of the different talks and lectures by artist John Howe, from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, one of the original Tolkien artists, one of the most popular ones. And he talks about, one of the things I love about his life experience as an artist is that he lives his art. He actually does a lot of medieval reenactments. He owns several handcrafted weapons that are, designed true to the original forging techniques of blacksmiths back in the day. He owns coats of armor. He does medieval reenactments where he learns about the food and the culture and how houses are built and stuff like that. And that knowledge, that personal experience, is injected into his artwork hugely. It has a huge and powerful impact on the quality of his artwork because he understands what it's like to actually be in a coat of armor. When he designed a lot of the armor and stuff like that for Lord of the Rings, he knew, for instance, that for certain types of characters, this type of armor would work and the other armor would not. What kind of armor would a ranger wear? What kind of armor would a warrior who jousts wear? What's the history of armor, and what type of culture could he inject into this armor? One of his documentaries, what's it called again? I can't remember what it's called. It's a documentary with John Howe. You can find it on YouTube. I can't remember what it's called. In any case, one of his fellow medieval reenactists, a guy who does medieval reenactments with him, mentions the fact that a lot of people will draw armor with a sword sticking out, blah blah blah. And what he says, one of the first things you learn when you actually wear a sword is the fact that it's very hard to get through a door with a sword, right? That kind of knowledge is very important. You learn a little bit about, there's some great videos on talking about people who do medieval reenactments that talk about different types of armor and different types of weapons, and they mention, for instance, something that's hugely beneficial for an artist to know is, the fact that they never wore belts. How did they hold up their boots? How did they, very often you would see leather armor or cloth armor that had slits in it. And very often people would make the mistake of putting kings and queens in fabric that had these slits, these kind of openings in them. When in fact, one of the major reasons why they would wear slits is because they would have slits in their clothing is because they were hand-me-downs from royalty. The royalty would have these clothes made for them because they had the money to afford it. And then they would very often hand it down to peasants. And what peasants would do is cut slits in the armor to help it stretch it and breathe so that it could fit on different body sizes. Right? It would stretch. It would be more malleable at that point. Those kinds of things are hugely important. Also, very often, you'd have armor, you'd have warriors in films fighting with swords, ting 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 ting, parrying with their swords and stuff like that. Block thrust. Most people during the medieval times who would engage in combat, engage in war, did not use swords. Why? Because they were very expensive to forge and broke very easily. Fighting with a sword, you were always very careful to not break it by bang, bang, ting, ting, ting it with somebody else. They would be very protective of their sword, how they used it, or wouldn't use it at all. The most common types of weapons that were used were stuff that were found on a farm. Pitchforks, spears, hammers, etc. Right? Swords is not something people would farm with. And very often it was farmers, people who were trying to protect their crops, protect their villages, that would fight. All this kind of information is hugely important. Now, if we take that information and we put it in the context of this guy, I'm always thinking about what it feels like to actually wear it. I'm designing it based on my own physiology, my own nerves, my own sense of pain. So in the case where I was pinning things into his shoulders, you notice I took them out. Why did I take them out? Because it creates a stress where I did not want to create a stress. By drilling something into his shoulders, I'm pulling all of the tension into his shoulders. That's a different type of stress. That's an anxiety of the unknown, right? Very often if I'm going to create a tension in the upper part of the body like I did with anguish, and that I will be embellishing with anguish as well later on, it's an anxiety. He's not feeling anxiety, he's feeling humiliation. That's a core suffering, right? So by putting those pins in his shoulders, I'm pulling it up to his shoulders. I'm basically, again, adding aesthetics for the sake of adding aesthetics. It does not fit into the narrative. I want to make sure that I have a center of suffering for each one of my characters. You can look at it, this is something I learned in animation, but you can look at it as a power center. When you're creating a character, try to focus on having often, especially if you're creating a cast of characters, you can separate it into power centers. This is something I learned from Ed Hooks, an acting for animation teacher, a well-known one. He talks about power centers. When you're animating, you would be, imagine the power center being in your nose, and the power center is a pulling force. So everywhere this character moves, he's being pulled by his nose. Imagine it being a pervert, where his power center is his groin. It's also a pulling force where his crotch is being pulled towards every sexy woman he sees. Imagine your power center being your gut, where it's like this character, he's suffering, right? Where it's a pushing force that pushes and digs into your gut. So as he's moving, he's always got this force holding him back. And if you can direct your design, direct your animation based on that, you can create very original and powerful feelings. You can evoke a lot of emotion in a way that your audience might not necessarily be aware of, but your entire design process and visual storytelling process is based around that very thought process, and you're doing so very consciously, right? Anguish, his power center is his shoulders and neck. Ugh, pain, tension in his neck. Anguish has got a low center of gravity in his gut, so when I emphasize that power center, I'm going to emphasize his gut, the weight. In suppression, it's in his gut. In burden, the power center is the mouth. It's venomous words coming out of the mouth, from the throat, from the throat outwards. In ridicule, it's his gut. So you notice that I have all of the tension points meeting into his gut, his groin, his rib cage. It's all tearing around his intestines, his abdomen, his stomach, his heart, all those areas, all those parts of his digestive system, right, where a lot of tension happens. I also have tension weighing him down by his groin, right? All of that is all emphasized within, if you think about it, and this is actually something I'm only realizing now as I'm describing it to you, because a lot of the stuff very often, when you get into a certain headspace, you very often do things intuitively, and this is actually something I didn't do deliberately. But when I was imagining this character, when I was searching for those feelings in myself, looking at what I've drawn now, the area of tension, the area of suffering that I've emphasized in this character is the entire digestive system, right? Where it comes in and where it goes out. He's got a gag in his mouth, suggesting something he could potentially swallow. It goes into his gut and comes out of his digestive system, his groin, right? So if you think about it, his power center very much is his gut, and it all revolves around his gut, where that center of suffering is. And because he's got a hole in him, it's pulling you into his gut, right? That was something that was done deliberately. Whenever you're doing environment design, you're doing character design, if you create a tunnel, a visual tunnel, your eyes will naturally, the human tendency is to travel between it. So putting a focal point within that tunnel is something that helps draw your audience's attention. Well, in this particular case, the tunnel is his torso, right? So that's something interesting that to take into account. I was thinking about guttural pain, but I actually, in this particular case, I'm realizing now, and as I further emphasize it, I realize that what I've actually done is make his center of suffering his digestive system. Now, one last narrative piece that I wanted to bring into this is his skin and his actual level of body fat. Remember, every single element that you bring in from a designer's perspective should always speak towards the narrative, should always speak towards the backstory of your character. You'll notice in every case where I kind of deviated away from it, I lost something from it, right? And in this particular case, because he was a very lanky character, I thought about the idea of making him very anatomical in the sense that he has almost like zero body fat, where you can actually see all the striations of his muscles. You can see all the individual muscles, almost as if he's got just a thin layer of skin and that's it. And that was to emphasize his nudity, right? Altogether, he's very, very exposed. If he was, for instance, if I made him a chubby character with a lot of body fat, that conceals a lot of his anatomy. That conceals a lot. It feels less nude compared to somebody who is somebody who's anatomically very visible. All right. So all of that plays towards his narrative. In the case of suppression, if I was to design suppression based on how I did ridicule, if I made suppression ridicule as well, you can immediately start to realize that it wouldn't have the same impact that it does seeing this guy. So the fact that I made him skinny and lanky, the fact that I didn't give him a chin, kind of gave him a double chin type of idea, showing to emphasize that goofiness, and of course the stretch of his mouth because he's got a ball in his mouth, all of that all plays towards the narrative. And finally, because we're reaching the end of this video, his ears. This is actually something that's actually derived a little bit more from cartooning, because that is my background. I've mentioned that plenty of times. Ears in animation of animals, of any creature with long ears and stuff like that, can be used as an extra limb. The way his hands, you notice his hands kind of fold back and kind of in a goofy, kind of shy way. Well, his ears are an extension of his personality as well. If I had his ears perking upwards, imagine how that would affect his expression, right? The fact that they're downwards show humiliation, embarrassment, all of those things. So these are every part of the body. Remember to inject narrative into every part of the body when you're designing, from head to toe. And that will evolve and grow as you progress through different character designs. So that's it for part 4. Stay tuned for part 5 coming up soon. Thanks for watching.